A new report into familicide and domestic homicides in Ireland has issued its recommendations today. This includes establishing a domestic and family violence death review process. This report is historic, and I commend all of those who ensured that this groundbreaking work took place. It was secured following tireless campaigning from families who have been affected by this devastating violence. It's the culmination of many years of work by the late Nora Gibbons, who we remember, and by Maura Butler as chairs of the report, and I want to commend both women. It came after determined advocacy from those working within the sector for their determination to see this moment finally come and to ensure that no other families feel the same agony that they have been subjected to. Because familicide is an utterly devastating crime. This devastating violence cuts through families in the most cruel way. Families across Ireland live in its shadow as they struggle to comprehend the magnitude of their loss. Truth is, this state has been an outlier for too long in how it has failed to take a robust approach to addressing such crimes. The report recommends establishing the domestic and family violence death review process. It recommends that a national database be established for reporting on violent family deaths. And it also recommends a new agency for domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, as well as better training for people supporting families affected. It also, importantly, recommends that practical supports be put in place for families in the immediate aftermath of a violent death and indeed in the longer term. And I want to welcome every single one of these important recommendations. It's absolutely crucial that they are now enacted without delay so that real and meaningful change is delivered. Families have waited for so long already for these recommendations to come to light. So this groundbreaking report cannot be allowed to gather dust on a shelf or indeed be siphoned off to one department. We need to see urgency, a clear plan and a timeline for action, and that means an all-of-government approach. In the North, domestic violence homicide reviews have been in place for some time now, so the government might usefully look at what has worked well in the North and what can be improved so that families get the very best support possible. Tá an umarcha teaghlach scrista de war fin waru, mulam a bheachtas, níor stéin siad dá níireachtaí ag an rialtas chun córais cearta, Lóidre a chur bhaim chun dulin lech leis na cuireanna ú fásacha seo. Tá an tuarascail an bhréigean seo fáilsithe agus tá gealtanis haléire ag tastal óna teaghlaí seo go dtiocfaí athrú an gcóras. Minister, government has published this report. Can I ask, when will the recommendations become reality? Can I ask, will government ensure that this is implemented urgently so that families can get the support that they need without any further delay?
Thank Deputy McDonald for raising what is an exceptionally sensitive and important report into the most difficult circumstances possible. When Minister Harris was briefing the government yesterday morning on this report, it just reminded me, and I'm sure has reminded all of us, that there are a set of tragic circumstances that I think are beyond the ability of most of us even to imagine. And we can only recognise the trauma and then the bravery of many who have to live with the consequences of such death and violence. And as Deputy McDonald has done, I want to join with her in recognising the role of families who have engaged in this process and have done so in such a brave and such a dignified way. And their voices were so critical to the work that has now been carried out and to the publication of what has been a very, very substantial report. I'd also, Ceann Comhairle, if I may, like to make reference and recognition to the former Minister for Justice and our current colleague, Deputy Charlie Flanagan, who responded back to this such tragic and complex phenomenon by commissioning this report and by putting in place the process that the Dáil is now raising here today. So to deal with the two issues that Deputy McDonald raised there, and also with her important point there regarding that this has been a matter that is so important that it transcends the Department of Justice. Firstly, Deputy, how will we look to move this matter forward? We are going to do so now by the establishment of a number of groups that we believe will offer a cohesive and effective way for dealing with such tragedies. Dealing with such tragedies, firstly, in trying to prevent them happening, and secondly, when they do happen, in the saddest of occasions, what we can then do as the state to respond back to those who have survived familicide. So what will we do? Firstly, in line with the groups, with the report's recommendations, 3 different groups will be established. There will be an interdepartmental group, and there will be interdepartmental, Deputy, because you're right, this is such an important matter. It goes beyond the Department of Justice, and we recognise the role of the Department of Children, the HSE, and the Department of Education in regard to the matter. Secondly, we want to set up an advisory group made up of the NGOs and other stakeholders who have built up such expertise and insight into this tragic issue. And then finally, and I think most appropriately, we will put in place an advisory group which will be made up of the families of victims to hear their voices, to hear their views regarding how we respond back, as I said, to deaths, the circumstances of which are, I believe, beyond the ability of many of us to imagine, but we have a duty to respond back to them. Coming out of all of that, we will then look at how we go and implement that report, and I have no doubt at all that when those groups are established, Deputy, we will prioritise actions and lay out how they will be implemented. And from hearing Minister Harris speak about this matter yesterday, I have little doubt that we'll move to priority actions and then the implementation of them once these groups are established. I do want to briefly, though, conclude by acknowledging that there is already much work underway that does try to respond back to the loss of life in these terrible, terrible circumstances. The work that is underway now in relation to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence that is happening in our schools, happening by the provision of additional training and expertise, and the new work that is underway in relation to the setting up of refuges and how we can provide support for those who are fleeing the most difficult and desperate of circumstances. So I join with you in recognising the sensitivity of this matter, and you can be assured the government will do all we can to respond back to the recommendations that were issued in this such a substantial and important report yesterday.
Deputy McDonald.
Thank you, and thank you, Minister, for that response. And you have rightly described familicide and violence of this nature as being tragic. Certainly when you witness the absolute bewilderment of a survivor of this violence. I think of Kathleen Shad. I remember when I first met her and she told the story of losing her 2 boys. I mean, how to make sense of that is just beyond, I'm sure, any of us. And what families tell us is that they experience not just the trauma of a tragedy, but also a crime. These are crimes as well. They feel, in many cases, almost as onlookers, bystanders in their own heartbreaking chaos and tragedy. And they are met with a system that is not fully sympathetic, Minister, that certainly isn't organised around supporting these families and, crucially, learning from these events, learning from them, because all of this system needs to learn the red flags, the signals, the dangers, because the objective has to be to try and prevent these awful crimes again. Can I ask the Minister, you've described the groups you'll establish, which member of Cabinet will drive this work? Will it fall to the Taoiseach?